I get it. We live in trying times. You're stuck inside all day, which would be really awesome if you could get Dolphin Netplay to work. It's snowing halfway through April, but you're on online school anyway, so that's a potential snow day wasted. You now learn, work, and sleep all in the same room, and you have a sneaking suspicion that the people on your Minecraft server don't find your jokes funny anymore. In times like these, you really need to find a way to unwind. So you pop your copy of Mother into your NES, and by that I mean emulate it, through the Wii U or other methods, but you quickly realize that game sucks. So you think to yourself, gosh, I wish there was a game that was similar to this one stylistically and thematically, but better in nearly every single way. That's right, gamers, we're talking about my favorite SNES game, Mother 2. Also, I'll be making some comparisons to the first Mother game throughout this video, so if you don't know much about that one, you could watch my video on it, if you wanted, link in the description, but if you haven't watched it, you'll still understand just fine. To begin, let's talk about the most memorable part of this game, its charm. Laugh. This game has a very similar theme to the original Mother. You're exploring modern suburbs and cities, and you fight against wild animals, aliens, and robots. However, Earthbound leans more into its sci-fi themes than its predecessor. In the first game, it was just kind of like, yeah, there's aliens, but here a meteorite crashes next to your house, Jeff attacks with laser guns, that kind of thing. The game also seems to take some influence from psychedelics, because how else can you explain the coffee break, or magic cake, or whatever's going on in Moonside. Additionally, the game has a lot more humor than the others in the series, and it's all incredibly absurd. By the end of the game, you're exploring inside a man who has had himself literally turned into an entire dungeon, and you're just like, yeah, okay, this makes sense. All of this combines to make a wonderfully weird and unique experience. Well, all of that's great, but without fun gameplay, it's just a long and annoying movie. So let's start by talking about the combat, because they fixed it. Now, characters have unique battle abilities. Ness is the only one who can run away, and he wastes everybody's turn. What a moron. Paula can pray, which is just gambling. Hope it does something good instead of completely ruining your chances of winning. Jeff can use specific combat items, of which about 2 are actually useful, and the other 20 just waste inventory space. And Pooh can mirror an enemy, where he just kind of morphs into them like a Ditto or something, but it'll miss the majority of the time, so you're better off just forgetting this option exists. Additionally, they fixed the stats in this game, thank God. I still couldn't find any documentation of what they did in-game, but they're far easier to guess than the ones in the original. And the PSI system makes sense now. Everything scales properly, and there's some new abilities too. PSI Rocket is exclusive to Ness, and it hits every enemy. Pooh's PSI Starstorm is basically the same thing. Paula can still use PSI Fire and Freeze, but they now scale like you'd expect them to. She can also use PSI Thunder, but I honestly never figured out what that one does because it misses so often. Finally, Ness can use PSI Flash, which is one of the best moves for boss battles because it can inflict random status ailments and even just instantly kill enemies. I'm sorry, Plague Rat of Doom. You deserved better. There's also new equipment in this game, and it can be a little confusing at first. Ness can use either bats or yo-yos and slingshots, which work the same. Yo-yos and slingshots tend to be more powerful, but they're also less accurate, and they can't get critical hits. In other words, they're trash, and I feel bad for anyone who didn't know this and tried to use them throughout their playthrough. And then there's Pooh, who has exactly one item he can equip in each slot, and we'll get to the Sword of Kings later, but this means he's really underprepared for battle by the time you get him, and he also leaves your party later in the game, so you only use him for about 1/6 of your playthrough. His base stats improve rapidly, so the lack of equipment and levels aren't a huge problem, but it still seems like an odd choice on the part of the developers. There's one last interesting mechanic to talk about with the combat in this game, and it's the rolling HP and PP bars. Unlike in most games where you immediately take all the damage from an enemy's attack, in Earthbound your health drains steadily. It won't make much difference in the beginning because it drains quickly enough that you probably won't be able to do anything if you take anything under about 100 damage at one time. But later in the game, you can often prevent an ally from falling unconscious by using PSI Life Up or a healing item before their HP rolls all the way down to 0. I won't pretend this addition is anything groundbreaking, but it does add another level of decision-making and tension to the combat. Whenever an ally takes mortal damage, the battle becomes a race against the clock, as you try to navigate through menus efficiently enough to heal them before they die. It can also change the order in which you kill some enemies, because if you know an enemy will explode and deal massive damage upon defeat, it's important to kill them last, because ending the battle will also stop the rolling health bars. It's possible this general concept also works with a rolling PP bar, but I was never able to pull off anything to save PP, so I'm not certain it's possible. Again, it's nothing all that special, but it does at least make the repetitive turn-based combat a bit more interesting. Well, they fixed the combat, and that's great, but that's also only half the game. So let's talk about the overworld gameplay, because oh my god, it's so much better. The most striking change from the first game is the lack of random encounters. Now, instead of randomly running into enemies every other step and learning the true meaning of despair, the pain comes from remembering you can't outrun these overworld sprites. Earthbound also has a fairly unique advantage and disadvantage mechanic when it comes to overworld encounters. If you run into a sprite when its back is turned, you'll get a green swirl and an extra turn. If an enemy runs into you while your back is turned, you'll get a red swirl and the enemy will get an extra turn. Those are relatively rare though, and you'll get gray swirls most of the time, with no advantage for either side. Additionally, enemies will run away from you if you're a high enough level or are inside a dungeon and have beaten the Sanctuary Guardian, basically guaranteeing you start the fight with an advantage. Add on to that the fact that you instantly defeat enemies if you encounter them with advantage and are high enough level, and you save a lot of time on low level encounters from places you've already been. The final thing to note with encountering enemies on the overworld is that there's an exploit to avoid any enemies you just don't feel like fighting. Because enemies have a random chance of spawning anytime a new area of the map is brought into view, you'll sometimes be faced by an overwhelming number of enemies, and you'll sometimes find none at all. A way to manipulate both the number of enemies and the type of enemies is to just walk away so that they're far enough off screen to unload, and then walk back to see if you have better luck. I kind of feel guilty about doing this, but then I remember the enormous amount of time I saved by avoiding the most annoying enemies, and I don't feel that bad anymore. Earthbound also fixed a few of the things that annoyed me in Mother. While the way the game deals with money hasn't changed much, or at all really, there are a lot more ATMs, so whenever I needed cash, an ATM was never far away. Additionally, you no longer need to use your ATM card as an item to access the machine, you can just hit the left shoulder button instead. And while the game still doesn't have any straight vertical lines, it's far less obtrusive in this game, to the point I barely noticed it. But that's not to say the game fixed all of my complaints from the first one. The inventory system has barely been changed at all. You have more space in your inventory now, which is a good thing, but you also have more mandatory items to fill that extra space. Additionally, I don't know if it's just me, but this game seems a whole lot harder than Mother. It could be the lack of a spell like Dimension Warp that allows you to just dip out of any fight you don't want to be in, or it could be that encounters are just more brutal here, or it could be the fact that I actively avoided most encounters and was pretty good at it too. That's probably the reason actually. All I know is that I didn't game over once during my entire playthrough of Mother, and I game overed a lot in Earthbound. While you could make the argument that I did this to myself, maybe the player shouldn't have to spend so much time in the least interesting parts of the game, especially when the developers left in an exploit to skip these boring fights that I can almost guarantee they were aware of. Now, I normally don't mind a higher level of difficulty in games, but I definitely prefer it when I feel there was something I could have done differently to prevent failure. However, battle gameplay in this game takes about as much skill as playing Jigglypuff in Smash, so there's not all that much I could have changed to prevent death. It just feels like the game randomly decides, dude, let's just make the player spend another 15 minutes just trying to get back to where he died. The look on his face will be priceless. It'll be hilarious. I'm not laughing. Now, I could have potentially avoided a game over by using more restoration items or more powerful PSI moves, and you often have a lot of extra cash, so I guess I'll just buy some items at the no you won't. You're out of space. The inventory system and particularly brutal areas work together so well, it brings a tear to my eye. Many tears, actually. Now, this kind of thing is just kind of a fact of life with a lot of RPGs, so if you're able to stomach it in other games, you probably won't have much problem with this either. But abrupt difficulty spikes can just grind the pacing to a halt. Speaking of, I'm about to say something that'll scare anybody who's played Earthbound. Sword of Kings. Picture this for a second. You fight your way through half of Stonehenge Base, a fairly difficult dungeon. You finally enter a new area. I hope you like this place because you're going to be here for a while. Meet the true boss of Stonehenge Base, the Starman Super. Each Starman Super has a 1 in 128 chance of dropping the Sword of Kings. Now, this is optional, but it's also, literally the only weapon Pooh can use in the entire game, so most players who know about it will probably do whatever it takes to get their hands on it. Now, for those of you who can't easily grasp how annoying a 1 in 128 drop is, it took me 2.5 hours to get the Sword of Kings, and I was one of the lucky ones. However, grinding for this isn't all bad because you'll get a crazy number of levels from taking down a bunch of Starman Supers, making the areas that come next far easier. It's either waste your time here and get a cool weapon, or waste your time later in the game and get nothing but a nagging feeling that your time would be better spent elsewhere. The choice seems pretty easy to me. Now it's that time of the video again. I'm about to start talking about the story in Earthbound, so if you haven't played it and care about story spoilers, you should probably play it and click off before the next section. The story of Earthbound is mainly focused in the beginning and end of the game. For the majority of the experience, you're just kind of wandering from location to location, collecting melodies and occasionally facing off against the confusing secondary antagonist, the Mani Mani statue. And while the side stories found in each of the game's towns are often wacky and entertaining, I won't focus on them, and I'll instead only look at the main story. The game begins with a meteorite falling next to Ness's house. You team up with your friend and next-door neighbor Pokey to go check it out. You find Buzz, an alien definitely not B, who promptly gets absolutely wrecked by Pokey's mom, but has enough time to spout some exposition. To summarize this really long block of text, Giygas is making a bunch of people and animals act weird, and Ness is the chosen one, so he has to collect the 8 melodies to defeat Giygas and save the world. After collecting the melodies and defeating the evil part of Ness's mind, you head to Saturn Valley to find a device that can travel through both time and space, the tHiS Distorter. And it's about here that the game drops its lighthearted tone and gets suddenly and shockingly dark. The tHiS Distorter can't transport organic matter, so the party has their minds implanted into robot bodies with no guarantee that they'll ever get back to their organic bodies. They then travel back in time to the cave of the past to take on Giygas. After navigating the cave, you get to this unsettling room that looks like it's made out of intestines. Ew! The final boss starts with Giygas sporting this weird distorted version of Ness's face as he tries to take down Pokey, who has switched to what he believes is the more powerful side. After you tear into Pokey a little bit, he turns off the Devil's Machine that was keeping Giygas' power in check. And the visuals in this fight really speak for themselves. Combine that with the dialogue that's just, oh no, I don't like that, and you have a deeply disturbing fight. Eventually, your attacks stop working on Giygas, and you have to use Paula to pray for help from the friends you made along the way. However, it eventually seems like that stops working too, until one last mysterious character starts to pray, and as the text slowly fills in, you realize, oh, that's me, that's my name, and that is just such an incredible moment the first time you see it. After that, Giygas makes sure you don't leave without at least a little more trauma, and then the ending sequence starts. At the end of the game, the rest of your friends go home, and you end up wandering the world without any enemies at all, free to just explore and look for new dialogue. When you get tired of that, you talk to your mom and start the end credits. You see a bunch of pictures that were taken throughout the game, and all the characters you met on your journey, all while the song Smiles and Tears plays, emphasis on the tears part because I didn't cry, because I'm a big boy, but I really, really wanted to. It's an incredible way to end an incredible game. Earthbound takes everything great about the original Mother and adds to it, trying to patch out some of the flaws. It's not a perfect game, but it doesn't have to be. It looks great, it sounds great, it's fun most of the time, and it's simply a unique, unforgettable experience. If you watched through this entire thing but haven't played it, I highly recommend it, and if you're like what I assume most of the viewers at this point are and have played it, go play it again. It's just as fun the second time. Trust me. Hey. Thanks for watching to the end. If you haven't already, subscribing would be beyond epic, and I'd appreciate it a lot. Same with liking and commenting, and maybe checking me out on Twitch. Well, that's enough of that. Keep gaming, gamers. I'll see you in the next video.